Welcome to the 2022 Industry Leaders Update, and thank you for the opportunity to provide this information to you. My name is Alex Mandl, and I'm privileged to have the responsibility of executing the role of Chief Inspector of Explosives. During this presentation, my objectives are to provide a brief reminder of the purpose of explosives legislation, present to you an overview of the current state of regulatory compliance of the explosives segment of the resources industry, to share with you some current underlying concerns, to provide you with some examples of the reasons for those concerns, and announce some recent initiatives intended to assist the industry in achieving compliant operations. We'll also explain our view of the regulatory future and industry's part in it. Where particularly industry sectors are referenced, I will identify them specifically. Otherwise, observations made in the presentation may be taken as referencing all stakeholders operating in the explosives industry. Explosives, after all, are intended to explode, whatever the purpose of the explosion, and I intend to spend the first few slides setting the scene for this update by describing the explosives regulatory environment. Let's start with a quick reminder of what explosives are from a regulatory perspective. Explosives are defined in the Explosives Act 1999, and this definition is generally taken from national and internationally agreed regulations and standards. In Queensland, an explosive cannot legally exist without an authority. If a new explosive is brought to the market, it must be authorised, or it cannot be either imported, exported, manufactured, stored, transported or used. The legislation further provides that a person cannot do anything with an explosive unless they are firstly an appropriate person, and secondly, have an authority to do what they intend to do with the explosive. This explains why we have security clearances and licences. The reason for this restrictive regime, and it is that explosives, as you know, have unique properties. Massive amounts of energy are released in a few milliseconds. So if an explosion hazard exists, and there's an exposure to that hazard, if the hazard turns into an actual detonation, the consequence is a foregone conclusion, merely a matter of chemistry and physics. What is noteworthy is that increasingly often the very definition of an explosive under the Act is being either questioned or challenged as a result of either innovation or emergence of systems, products and processes. As a result, the effectiveness of the current legislation and its objective of keeping the community safe from explosives is increasingly being tested. Now, this is not an unusual state of affairs. Legislation by definition cannot easily provide for unknown unknowns, but serves to illustrate the need for strong informative links between the regulator, industry and the communities we serve. Now, what we, the regulator, see as the explosives regulatory environment is shown in this slide. Authorities are issued for a specific task or activity, and this explains why an industrial application may require a number of authorities. We're currently working to examine ways in which this system may be simplified, for example, by combining authorities in some sectors. Whilst mining remains by far the largest user of explosives in Queensland by volume, it's important to note that there are other sectors, both related to mining and unrelated, that make significant and necessary use of explosives. It ranges from the house builder who has no other practical method to excavate a foundation, to the annual river fire event in Brisbane, attended by 600,000 people in 2019. The regulatory environment has to cater for them all. There's an enormous variation in the nature and level of risk. Two application groups in particular, the space and sovereign defence manufacturing industry, are currently emerging and are requiring special consideration. This is not only because of their specific nature, but also their location in the community. We're not only now talking about explosives in the Bowen Basin and Northwest Minerals area, we start to talk about the scenic rim, suburban Brisbane, and coastal locations near existing major resources infrastructure. Some of the proponents of these new emerging industries are sophisticated and have brought well-developed technology from overseas. This has its own challenges in cases where the regulatory environment is assumed by the user to be the same as in their home country, and often it isn't. However, some of the entrants into these sectors are homegrown and very much in their infancy, and we've found that they require guidance in achieving the required level of regulatory compliance, and we take steps to assist them in their journey. Added to the complexity of dealing with these emerging uses of explosives in the community is the overlap with other jurisdictions, including Commonwealth agencies such as the Department of Defence and the Australian Space Agency. Now, having set the scene by describing the broader explosives application environment in Queensland, I'd now like to focus on the safety performance of the explosives industry, particularly in the resources sector. During 2021 and so far in 2022, as reported via the Explosives Incident Notification System, including incidents not reported that we've become aware of, there have been 0 serious harm incidents. No fatalities, no serious injuries requiring hospitalisation or ongoing permanent disability. Within RSHQ, this sets explosives apart from the other legislated activities associated with mining, quarrying, petroleum and gas. And this follows a well-trodden path. Major incidents and instances of serious harm are infrequent, largely because of factors such as the preponderance of engineering solutions to risk mitigation, controls, and the strict regulatory environment. The explosives industry and explosives users have long considered that explosives incidents are a low probability, high consequence phenomena. And yet, every 5 years or so there is a significant incident. The last major incident was on 5th of September 2014 at Angelala Creek near Charleville and involved a very large explosion of ammonium nitrate being transported by road. But during the intervening period, there have also been incidents which do not result in fatalities or injuries, but can readily be described as high potential. Misfires, for example, manufacturing incidents, fume events are all examples of the potential for serious harm. Now, as a counterpoint to the last slide, this one shows what's been going on over the past 12 months or so in other parts of the world in regard to explosives incidents, with far greater actual consequence than our high potential incidents and near misses. These are all accidents involving explosives transportation, manufacturing and use, the very same application activities that are performed in Australia, including obviously in Queensland. Whilst it's obvious that controls have failed, these are generally pointers to the possibilities that controls can fail and do, or at the very least, what happens when the controls are not present or effective. Do we have the same systems of control in our activities? And have we assumed them to be effective because they have yet to be tested? Note the characteristic result of catastrophic explosives accidents. There are almost always multiple fatalities and severe damage to infrastructure. From a regulatory perspective, there is a clear need to ensure that the community not involved in the activities are protected from the consequences. After all, in too many cases, it's the community that bears the cost of reconstruction of infrastructure. At the very least, the frequency of accidents resulting in serious harm around the world should lead to a chronic sense of unease. I'd like to illustrate some factors influencing regulatory concerns by making use of a fairly common representation of innovation in an industrial market. It's well known and demonstrated that as systems reach maturity, focus tends to transfer to emerging innovations and market opportunities. Resources go into the new systems, products and processes and compete with existing capabilities for manufacturing, transportation and storage, and this can affect maintenance and repairs, concentration on investigating defects, and the emergence of previously unknown faults. What do we see as a regulator? Hazard forgetfulness is where focus is transferred to emerging products, processes and systems, and knowledge and experience undergoes a generational change. We see the re-emergence of hazards and incidents that were previously assumed to have been satisfactorily controlled. Simple misfire causation, manufacturing faults, delivery equipment failures. And don't forget about latency. Takata airbags come to mind. If your systems are still in use, you must operate them safely. No ifs, buts or maybes. Despite what industries tend to believe, history is replete with examples of the emergence of previously unknown hazards that are inherent in systems introduced with an assurance of hazards engineered out or with adequate controls. Failures in electronic initiation systems are now emerging and some are bypassing all known controls. Is the circuit design really fail-safe? And if so, how do you know? What do we see from the data we collect? This slide illustrates the compliance actions taken by the Explosives Inspectorate as the industry regulator. These compliance actions result from inspections, audits, incident response and investigations conducted by the Inspectorate and stakeholders. There are two key observations I'd like to make, and these are shown by the red numbered indicators on the slide. The graph titled Statutory Actions Taken by Type relates to specific compliance action taken by the Inspectorate. Observation 1 indicates the limit of effective controls assessed by the attending Inspector of Explosives. Compliance actions shown below this line are for situations below an acceptable level of safety. Directions and remediation action notices, represented by the first two bars, are issued in circumstances where controls exist but may be weak and requiring improvement. Compliance actions for situations found to be below the red line are taken where controls do not exist or are considered so deficient that immediate action must be taken by the authority holder. Observation 2 indicates our concern at delays in receiving information regarding responses to requests for incident investigations and corrective action. Follow-up requests from the Inspectorate are from time to time deflected, with further inquiry showing a tendency to pursue expedient remediation ahead of a positive response to a safety or security deficiency. This slide deals with incidents 2021 to year to date. I'd like to draw your attention to the pie chart on the left, which illustrates the type of incident reports received. The three highlighted types are incidents of well-known risks with well-known, indeed mandated controls, and yet they still occur, and the quality of investigation and corrective action is sometimes cursory at best. I suggest to you that this is a type of hazard forgetfulness or normalisation. At the top right, the top two causes of misfires are illustrative of an industry that does not seem to be able to or want to manage an obvious form of failure in the use of explosives. This is almost certainly a form of normalisation of a hazard that is created, not just existing, as a result of known and uncontrolled failures in the blasting process. Each of the following two examples are high potential near misses, all involving some form of injury, although not categorised as serious harm. The first two are specifically mining related and occurred as the result of a previous failure of a blasting operation, which left explosives unaccounted for and unknown as a hazard. I must point out that although these incidents occurred at specific operations, the conditions exist throughout the mining industry. This incident was the result of an excavator bucket contacting hitherto undetected explosives remaining from a previous blast, and incontrovertibly constitutes an example of a material risk of serious harm. The excavator operator was uninjured, but received a serious fright, and the nearby haul truck operator was deafened. It could so easily have been an actual serious harm incident. I am pleased to report that in this particular example, the operator performed a very detailed investigation, but the underlying root cause remains a hypothesis. In respect of an incident of this type, the controls can be seen to have been ineffective. The explosives were present, available to be impacted by the excavator, and no one could see exactly how they came to be there. The precursor event, a misfire, occurs on more than a weekly basis in Queensland mining operations. You saw the graph. That's industry telling us what's happening. This incident is another example of a misfire which left an unknown hazard and unknown exposure, underground this time. There have been two significant incidents of this type in the past year or so. The last one involved actual injury, although luckily minor. That is, if you can call being struck by multiple pieces of fly rock minor. What happened was that during a scaling operation, a mechanical tool impacted undetonated explosives, and they detonated. Why was a mechanical tool being used if explosives were present? You wouldn't ram a drill steel into a detonator or a booster, but that's exactly what this incident can be likened to. I strongly recommend that operators analyse these incidents carefully. Use a fault tree or bow tie technique to determine where the controls were either non-existent or at best ineffective. I can guarantee you that the answers become readily visible, and the remaining question is, why haven't these incidents been eliminated? The significant sense of unease that we felt from these incidents and the concern from sectors of the industry has led to the commencement of a multi-party initiative, the Misfire Working Group. I won't call it the Queensland group because although the majority of participants are from Queensland, we do have representation from interstate, which is great to see. The objective? To produce a best practice guideline to assist in the elimination of misfires. We had over 70 firm responses to our initial calls for participation, and participation consists of members from the resources industry, mining and quarrying, explosives suppliers, consultants, workers' representatives and academia. The guideline is currently in an early draft form now, and we aim for it to be released at the end of the financial year. And I'd like to express our appreciation for the level of interest and enthusiastic participation of the industry members engaged in this important work. This incident is illustrative of the potential consequences of errors in identifying hazards, assessing risks and putting in place the required controls. The incident is subject to ongoing investigation and compliance action, so my description will be brief. Explosives activities are often carried out in close proximity to community infrastructure and indeed members of the community. Quarrying is a resource activity that frequently encounters this environment. The safety of the community and the protection of its assets depends on the knowledge, skills, experience, competence and diligence of the explosives authority holder. Where a licensed shot firer is involved and has the responsibility for the safe execution of the blasting activity, accountability is clear and relatively unequivocal. Swift compliance action can be taken. On mine sites, including quarries, where the SSE has appointed a shot firer under the relevant mining legislation, the accountability for safety relies on the person appointing the shot firer being certain that the competence requirements have been met. For SSEs, these appointments should not be made lightly. Security clearances set a bar for entry into working with security-sensitive explosives. It is the basis of being considered an appropriate person. Approximately 18% of applications for a security clearance have a criminal history. By far the majority of those are eventually cleared because the criminal history does not involve offences which are considered relevant to the employment. However, attempting to conceal a criminal history does not assist an application and is pointless. The information is provided to the Inspectorate directly from law enforcement agencies. Employers and employees in the explosives industry do need to be aware that there is one category of offence which automatically results in a finding of not being an appropriate person, and that is domestic violence. The Chief Inspector, myself, has no discretion for domestic violence offences, and it is pointless for affected persons or their employers to make representation to the Inspectorate. The only means of achieving a security clearance in this instance is if and when the domestic violence order is no longer current. Now, last month we made an improvement to the security clearance framework. Employers validating the status of employee security clearances can now perform this task online. There is no longer any need to contact the Inspectorate to execute this simple task. Another recent development has been the acquisition of additional land to permit the expansion of the capacity of the Bejewel Government Explosives Reserve. An additional 635 hectares has been obtained, and expressions of interest for use are currently being sought from industry. This acquisition will enable a transformation in the way explosives are manufactured, stored and distributed from Bejewel. A fun fact, the perimeter security fence will be over 10 kilometres in length. The RSHQ compliance policy forms the basis of compliance action taken by the Explosives Inspectorate. At the moment, our posture is largely corrective in nature, and you could see that from the ratio of directions issued to more serious compliance actions. However, our posture changes as the need arises, and I'd like to point out that during this presentation, I've indicated concern about complacency, normalisation of risk, and a lack of timely engagement with the regulator. We do take deterrent action where required, and this often results in licence suspension and even cancellation. Our compliance action posture will also change if the need arises and the overall risk environment deteriorates, and I trust that will not be necessary. I'd like to close with reference to the Brady Review report. Most will be familiar with the review of all fatal accidents in Queensland mines and quarries from 2000 to 2019. And the review was commissioned by the then Minister for Natural Resources, Mines and Energy, Dr. Anthony Lynham, following the 5 fatalities that occurred in the Queensland mining industry during the 2018-2019 financial year. In our review of incidents, which the Explosives Inspectorate performs on a weekly and monthly basis, we see a recurrence of incidents of types that are generally well covered in safety and security management systems. Why then do these failures occur? And the Brady Review report provides some useful clues, and while focused on mining, describes characteristics that equally apply to explosive stakeholders. And these include weaknesses in systems that, if not corrected, expose stakeholders to uncontrolled hazards. The current situation with respect to misfires is a classic example. I urge you to consider the characteristics described in Section 6 of the report that deals with the hypothesis of drifting into failure. I'd also strongly recommend reference to Section 7, which deals with high reliability organisations such as airlines. These organisations also deal with low frequency, high consequence incident risks, and the explosives industry is a readily recognisable parallel. Thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, I can be contacted as shown on the slide. Thank you.